Britain blocks U.S. military action. The Iran crisis just got worse. It wasn't a missile. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't even a breaking news alert. It was a phone call. A short, quiet, unfiltered conversation between two of the most powerful leaders on Earth. And it may have just redrawn the boundaries of global power. On the evening of February 20th, 2026, Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer told President Donald Trump the one word Washington never expects to hear from London. No. No. You cannot use our bases. No. You cannot launch your war from British soil. No. We will not be part of your strike on Iran. And with that, the special relationship, the alliance that has defined the Western world for nearly a century, entered a crisis not seen since the Suez debacle of 1956. Because this wasn't just a diplomatic disagreement, it was an act of defiance, quiet, calculated, and historic. For decades, the US-UK alliance has been more than friendship. It's been architecture, the foundation stone of NATO, of Western military coordination, of global confidence in American leadership. From World War II to Afghanistan, Britain stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States. Every time America called, Britain answered, even when the call led to controversy, as in Iraq. But this time, it didn't. Starmer told Trump that Britain would not authorize the use of two bases, Diego Garcia in the central Indian Ocean and RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire. Both are vital. Both are under British jurisdiction. Without them, the U.S. cannot conduct a sustained bombing campaign on Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure. Starmer's reason? International law. He told Trump that a preemptive strike, without UN authorization, without imminent threat, would be illegal under the UN Charter. He also knew what Trump's advisors refused to admit publicly. Iran would strike back. Not only at the U.S., but at any ally that participated. To understand the gravity of this decision, we need to talk logistics. In June 2025, during Operation Midnight Hammer, the U.S. bombed Iranian nuclear sites at Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. Those bombers, B-2 Spirits, flew from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. That's a 16,000-mile round trip. It worked once, but only once. Now Trump is planning something far larger, a multi-week campaign, striking Iran's nuclear facilities, missile silos, and command centers. You can't do that from Missouri. You need forward bases. You need Diego Garcia, a launch pad for stealth bombers in the Indian Ocean. And you need RAF Fairford, America's European bomber hub, equipped for sustained operations. Those two bases were the keystones of the Pentagon strategy. Now both are gone. Britain's no didn't happen in a vacuum. It triggered a chain reaction across the Middle East. Within hours, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain, all home to major U.S. military installations, also said no. They will not allow Washington to launch a war on Iran from their soil, not out of defiance, but out of fear, because Iran's Revolutionary Guard made it clear, every base that supports an attack becomes a target. In simple terms, if a U.S. jet takes off from your country to bomb Iran, that country will be bombed in return. And for Gulf states, that's an existential risk. Iran's missile range covers all of them, their refineries, desalination plants, airports, all within reach. So they said no, one by one, silently, systematically. The U.S. found itself surrounded by allies and isolated by their caution. Inside the White House, Trump's anger was volcanic. He went on Truth Social, declaring that if Iran refused to make a deal, the United States may be required to use the blocked bases anyway, and then he retaliated. Trump withdrew U.S. support for the $35 billion Chagos Islands Agreement, a diplomatic win Starmer had spent months negotiating with Mauritius. The message was clear. You crossed me. You pay the price. But Starmer didn't blink. He knew this wasn't just about Britain's sovereignty. It was about the survival of the rules-based order that Trump himself was tearing apart. And within hours, global headlines captured what the Pentagon had feared most. America's closest ally just broke ranks. So, what happens now? Without Britain, the U.S. faces an impossible map. To wage a sustained air campaign, you need proximity, short routes, refueling hubs, reliable supply chains. With Diego Garcia and Fairford denied, the only viable platforms are aircraft carriers, the USS Abraham Lincoln and USS Gerald R. Ford. But there's a problem. Carriers are vulnerable. For 40 years, Iran has built its military doctrine around carrier killer weapons, hypersonic missiles, swarm drones, and fast attack boats. They know they can't outgun the U.S., so they built systems to bleed the U.S. Launching the war from carriers means putting 13,000 sailors directly in Iran's crosshairs. Even a single hit could sink not just a ship, but global confidence in American naval supremacy. And the Pentagon knows it. Britain's refusal isn't only moral, it's legal. Under post-war agreements, U.S. bases on British territory can only be used with explicit approval from London for operations against third countries. Starmer's legal advisors warned him, if Britain allows a preemptive strike and it's later judged unlawful, the UK could be held jointly responsible for war crimes. That's not speculation, that's international law. And with Russia's nuclear threat still hanging over Europe, Britain cannot afford another front. Because while Iran is not a formal Russian ally, Russian warships are currently docked in Iranian waters, sharing radar data and surveillance. If British bases were used and Iran retaliated, Russia could claim defensive cooperation and intervene. Starmer's decision wasn't weakness, it was survival. This is the part the media rarely mentions. Since the Ukraine war, Moscow has been searching for leverage outside Europe. Iran provides it. Russian naval vessels in the Persian Gulf now relay tracking data to Tehran's military. Russian intelligence officers train Iranian cyber units. And the Su-35 fighter jets Russia delivered last year are now part of Iran's integrated defense network. So if the U.S. attacks, Russia will have front-row access to American tactics, technology, and weaknesses in real time. Britain's intelligence agencies know this. That's why Starmer said no. Because once the first bomb drops, no one controls the escalation. For Trump, this was supposed to be simple. Issue an ultimatum, pressure Iran, project dominance. But the old playbook doesn't work anymore. The United States still has unmatched military power, but it's no longer unchallenged. Every move now comes with consequences measured in markets, alliances, and credibility. And this week, credibility is what Washington lost. When America's closest allies, Britain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, all refuse participation, the message to the world is unmistakable. The fear that once defined U.S. power is fading. Wars don't just move armies, they move markets. As the Iran crisis deepens, investors are signaling what governments won't say aloud. They have lost confidence in the United States' ability to manage escalation. Gold has surged past $5,000 an ounce. Oil has spiked toward $150 a barrel. And for the first time in decades, the U.S. dollar is weakening during a global crisis. In past conflicts, the dollar strengthened. It was the ultimate safe haven. Now, money is fleeing not to Washington, but to commodities, things that hold value no matter who wins. That's not a market reaction. That's a vote of no confidence in the stability of the American-led system. In Riyadh, Doha, and Abu Dhabi, something extraordinary is happening. The Gulf monarchies, once the backbone of America's Middle East dominance, are quietly pivoting. They're still hosting U.S. bases, but politically, they're distancing themselves. Behind closed doors, Saudi diplomats are engaging with Beijing and Moscow, exploring new frameworks for regional security that exclude Washington altogether. They've seen what happens when America starts a war it can't finish. They saw it in Iraq. They saw it in Afghanistan. They don't want to see it again. And so they're hedging, betting that a multipolar world is safer than an unpredictable superpower. In Downing Street, the mood is cautious but resolute. Starmer's advisors know they've crossed a line, but they believe history will vindicate them. British intelligence has warned that if the U.S. attacks Iran, Tehran's retaliation will include cyber strikes on Western financial infrastructure, banks, energy grids, hospitals, and Iran's cyber capabilities, while underestimated are advanced. They've already hit Israel's water systems, U.S. municipal networks, and European power grids. A war with Iran wouldn't just be fought in the desert. It would be fought in code, on servers, satellites, and digital backbones that connect every major economy. Starmer's logic is simple. If you can't win cleanly, don't start at all. Trump now faces a paradox. He promised strength. He promised action. He promised that Iran would never have a nuclear weapon. But every path to proving that strength now looks like weakness. If he attacks without allies, he proves America's isolation. If he backs down, he looks defeated. And if he drags Britain in against its will, he fractures the Western alliance permanently. This is the trap of ego geopolitics. When every choice damages the chooser, it's impossible to ignore the echoes. In 2003, when George W. Bush sought allies for the Iraq invasion, Tony Blair said yes. The result was catastrophic for Iraq, for the Middle East, and for Britain's credibility. 23 years later, Keir Starmer is doing what Blair didn't. He's saying no, because Britain learned the hardest possible lesson, that loyalty without legality is not strength, it's submission. And this time, history may remember Starmer's defiance as an act of preservation, not betrayal. Trump's 14-day ultimatum to Iran is still ticking. 10 days remain before the deadline expires. But the world is already feeling the tremors. Markets are volatile. Allies are nervous. Tehran is preparing. The White House insists that diplomacy is still possible. But behind the scenes, military planners are drawing up scenarios, from limited strikes to full-scale escalation. And every version ends with the same question. Where do you launch from when no one will open their skies? In Beijing, the Foreign Ministry called Britain's move an example of responsible diplomacy. In Moscow, state media praised Starmer for rejecting American imperial arrogance. And across Europe, leaders are quietly relieved because Britain just gave them political cover to say no to. The United States is discovering what it means to lead in a world that no longer follows. This isn't the collapse of American power. It's the fragmentation of its authority. And once it breaks, it rarely returns to its original shape. At the Pentagon, planners now face a reality that hasn't existed since before World War II. America may have to go to war, alone. No coalition, no shared burden, no European staging grounds. For the first time in living memory, the United States cannot assume that its allies will fight its wars for it. That's not just strategy, that's psychology. Because the myth of unshakable Western unity has been the backbone of deterrence for 70 years. Once that myth cracks, even adversaries begin to test the boundaries. And they already are. The US-UK special relationship has survived everything: wars, recessions, political shifts, even personalities. But it's never faced a divide this deep. Britain's refusal doesn't mean the alliance is dead, but it means it's changing, from obedience to partnership, from hierarchy to sovereignty. This was the week Britain reminded the world, and Washington, that friendship is not fealty. And for America, that realization may be harder to accept than any military defeat. What we are witnessing is not just a diplomatic rift. It's the slow dismantling of unipolar power. The United States can still project force anywhere on Earth, but it can no longer assume the moral or political consensus to do so. Every war since Iraq has chipped away at that assumption. And this one, if it happens, could finally break it. Because what's collapsing isn't the military capability of the United States. It's the faith that once surrounded it. As the 10-day countdown continues, the world is entering uncharted territory. Britain has said no. Europe is staying silent. The Arab world is stepping back. Russia and China are watching, not as spectators, but as participants in shaping what comes next. The question isn't whether America can strike Iran. It's whether it can survive the consequences of doing so. And for the first time in decades, that answer isn't obvious. This isn't about Iran alone. It's about what happens when power loses persuasion, when threats replace strategy, when loyalty becomes leverage. Donald Trump's ultimatum to Iran was meant to project strength. Instead, it exposed fragility, not just of policy, but of partnership. Keir Starmer's refusal was more than an act of diplomacy. It was a statement that law still matters, that restraint still has value, and that even the strongest alliance can fracture under reckless pressure. And somewhere between Washington's anger and London's calm, the world just witnessed a shift that historians will mark as the moment the Western alliance began to realign itself. February 2026. Britain said no. The world held its breath. Alliances are not built on fear. They're built on trust. And when trust breaks, even quietly, even once, the world changes forever.